We have had a brand new Balance Dataslate and Mortarion field manual, and with that comes a good chance to look at another top 5 units for one of our 40k armies. And today we are going to dive into the filthy mucky pit that is the Death Guard. The Death Guard got off to a fairly rocky start in 10th edition with a load of high costed units and some incredibly lackluster army and detachment rules, to be honest. The detachment rule as it was basically just sticky objectives, which is in itself a good ability, but it's just not particularly exciting as a whole detachment rule. Now, these got updated in previous data slates, and the Death Guard are now in a much better spot, sitting around the 50% win rate, so they're kind of exactly where GW want them to be. Their Nurgle's Gift army rule is still a slow starting but eventually very potent buff that just gets better as the game goes on. It spreads an aura of -1 toughness to enemies within 9 inches from battle round 3, and it can be very nasty and really help you to hit those crucial breakpoints against anything from Marines to Guardsmen to vehicles, and it really does make a lot of Death Guard damage output a lot more impactful than it may initially appear. On top of that, the detachment rule, Spread the Sickness, got a huge boost, moving from just sticky objectives to gaining a whole new effect. They essentially now let you choose a sickness before the game begins, which can have some really detrimental debuffs onto the enemy. You can reduce their armor saves, you can drop their OC value and leadership, you can even reduce their weapon and ballistic skill whilst they are in contagion range. It is very much an army that weathers a few turns, and then when everything is all bunched up and your contagion range has spread out a bit more, you will just dominate the midfield, destroy your enemy's defenses and ability to score points, and just overwhelm them. It's very thematic, very fun, and actually really quite powerful now. But with all that in mind, let's take a look at 5 of their units that I think seem quite good, and that personally I would be considering if I was going to be building a competitive Death Guard army. And first up we have one of the greatest named units in the game, the Feted bloat drone. This boy got a little bit of a drop in the latest field manual, going from 100 points down to 90, and for that you get a really nice 10-inch move, toughness 9, 10 wounds, and a 3-up save with a 5-up invuln, so it is reasonably tanky and also reasonably speedy for the cost, and can, if nothing else, be a really great way to move up the board and start spreading those contagion debuffs to enemy units as the rest of your army gets set up in position. They can be built for pure melee or a bit of a mix of melee and shooting. They come stock with a Plague Probe for 3 kind of meh strength 6, -1 AP, 1 damage, lethal hit attacks, but also the much better Flesh Mower, which is also lethal hits, but is instead 10, strength 7, -1 AP, 2 damage attacks. So this is really solid at chewing through Marines, can kill 3 outright if you choose the -1 armor save sickness debuff, so it definitely isn't bad. You can, however, if you want to, swap the Flesh Mower out if you want these guys shooting instead. 2 Plague Spitters can be taken, which gets you 2d6 anti-infantry shots at strength 6, -1 AP and 1 damage, or what is probably my preferred option would be the Heavy Blight Launcher, which again gets you those tasty lethal hits, but this gun is 6 shots at 36 inches and is at strength 8, -2 AP and 2 damage, so again it's got that really good anti-marine profile, and can also potentially push up into light vehicle duties too, especially if you have a vehicle that is at -1 toughness due to another Death Guard unit being nearby. I just think the bloat drone is a solid all-round melee or ranged unit. It's reasonably cheap, it's a great way to spread those debuffs around early on in the game, and it can just act as a nuisance harassment unit that can actually put out more damage than you may expect for the cost. So I really love these guys, and I think they can add quite a significant amount to almost any Death Guard list. Next, we have a unit that was actually nerfed a little bit in terms of how they perform, but they are still very much worth taking in my opinion. The Biologus Putrifier is an incredibly cheap 50 points, and it gets you a toughness 5 4-wound model with a 3-up save. He can join Plague Marines as a leader, and he nets them lethal hits, which is great for some of the weapons they can take, like melter or plasma guns, although it's not as useful as you may expect because most of the Plague Marine weapons already have lethal hits anyway. But they do get better because of the putrifier, because he actually allows them to critically hit on 5s rather than 6s, so that can be a big increase in terms of their damage output, especially against tougher targets like vehicles and knights, and it's going to allow even their humble plague bolt guns to start wounding anything, including knights, on a hit roll of a 5+. And that can very much add up over the course of the game by cutting out that incredibly painful 5 or 6+ to wound stage of your rolling. So I would say he's actually potentially a valuable addition for 50 points alone just for that ability, in addition to his token output from his blight grenades and his plague knives. But he also brings another fantastic ability in the explosive maladies rule. And what this does is it allows you to use the grenade stratagem for 0 CP even if you've already used it in the phase previously. This has been nerfed now, so you can choose one model with this rule to do it. You can't just bring 3 putrifiers now and have them all use the grenade strat for free in a single phase. But still, even just one more free use of it can be really handy. It can put a few extra, average of 3 but up to 6 mortal wounds into an enemy unit within 8 inches of him, so it is just a nice bit of extra free damage output. For me, the putrifier just adds a good bit of force multiplication in the lethal hit bonuses, and for 50 points, an extra little bit of chip damage in terms of his mortal wounds, which is always welcome. It's definitely clear to me why 3 were brought in every list before, because they could all do the grenade strat and just dump a load of mortal wounds into an enemy squad. But I think even with this change, still bringing 1 is very much going to work just to improve the unit of Plague Marines they join and just add a little bit of chip damage from the grenade stratagem that you can do whenever you get the chance to for free. In the third spot in this list, we have those aforementioned Plague Marines. These guys did actually get a points bump in the latest field manual. They jumped a hefty 2 points per model. So a squad of 10 is now 180 points instead of 160. So you are paying 18 points now for a toughness 5, 2 wound stat line with a 5-inch move and a 3-up save. They do have OC2 as your main battle line scoring choice, and their special ability is, it's rather dull, but it is potentially quite handy if you are going for the objective scoring mindset. It lets you add 1 to battle shock tests when they are in range of an objective you control. And with their leadership of 6, that means you are going to be passing battle shock most of the time. So it can come in handy. It is a useful ability to have just to avoid being battle shocked, but it's certainly not the most exciting ability out there. And I think in general, these guys can sometimes feel a little bit squishier than you might want them to, considering they used to have abilities in previous editions that gave them things like feel no pain or -1 damage. Now they just have that toughness 5 to represent their increased durability. But still, that does mean for 18 points they are slightly tougher than your average Marine, which are toughness 4, and they do also come with a fairly solid set of weapon options. They can be taken in squads of 5, 7 or 10, so if you want to bring the magic Nurgle number you can take 7, but 5 or 10 is where you get the most bang for your buck in terms of the upgrades you can take. All of them have a Plague Bolt Gun, which is basically just an improved bolter with lethal hits, but you can basically replace all of the bolters in the squad in the form of a special weapon if you want. 1 in 5 can take a Blight Launcher, 1 in 5 can take a Plague Spewer, 1 in 5 can take a Melter, Plague Belcher or Plasma Gun, and then 2 in every 5 can have a combination of melee weapons, either bubotic weapons or heavy plague weapons. So in a 5-man squad, you could make them pure melee with 2 heavy plague weapons and 3 bubotic weapons, or you can mix and match, taking say a Blight Launcher, a Plasma Gun, and then 2 heavy plague weapons for when the enemy gets close. It is a nice customizable little unit, and I personally would probably end up taking something like the Blight Launcher for the 2 damage anti-marine shots, a couple of heavy plague weapons for the strength 8 2 damage with the lethal hits if you get into melee, and then maybe a Plasma Gun or a Plague Spewer depending on whether you wanted a bit more anti-marine or some good chaff clearing potential from the flamer. It is just a very nice, slightly more expensive, but still very durable unit that you can really go around to claim objectives, get them stickied for you, help spread your diseases around when they're in combat or near an enemy, and then when they are fighting, thanks to almost all of their weapons having lethal hits, as well as potentially inflicting -1 toughness and -1 save onto their opponent, they can actually do a lot more damage than you might think. Their weapons can all effectively become +1 to wound and +1 rend against the right targets, which makes them super versatile, and I still think even with the points increase, they are a brilliant, almost auto pick in Death Guard armies. The big man himself is also massively improved. Mortarion is still 325 points, which actually isn't terrible at all considering he is a toughness 12, 16 wound monstrosity with a 2-up save, a 4-up invuln, and 5-up feel no pain. He is incredibly tanky for his cost, and he even has that devastating wound protection with his feel no pain, which is really useful. And just as a rough idea, even something like Angron swinging into him will only take him down 8 wounds, so it will still leave him at half health, so he is definitely going to be sticking around for a good long while in your games. On top of that, he's got a 10-inch move, so he can again get up into contagion range and start spreading your sicknesses around very quickly, which can, help keep him alive for longer as well, and also importantly act as that force multiplier for the rest of your army. In terms of his damage output, he's got a psychic power Rotwind, which is d6 plus 3 shots at strength 7, -2 AP, 1 damage, but it has blast, lethal hits, and devastating wounds. And with an 18-inch range, he will most likely be able to hit almost anything he wants to after he's moved, so it is a big threat. And with that trifecta of special rules, it can do good damage to hordes, to elite units like Terminators, and even to tougher vehicles, so it is really strong as an ability, even with just 1 damage, I think. He can also shoot the Lantern, which is his pistol. Again, this is 18 inches and it's strength 9, -3 AP, 3 damage, but has sustained hits D3. So he can potentially get up to 4 shots with this, which is really good. And again, it gives him some brilliant anti-elite or anti-light vehicle firepower to add to the mix. In combat, he's got his Scythe Silence, and as you would expect from a big guy, he's got a strike and a sweep profile. Strike is 5 attacks at strength 14, -3 AP, 4 damage with lethal hits, which is brilliant, especially because he will be in contagion range when he's using this, so going into something even like a knight, he will be hitting and wounding on 2s, and he can push them back to having no save if you picked the -1 save sickness, so he can easily do a solid 14 damage to an enemy knight in 1 round, which really is quite respectable. And then against hordes, the sweep profile is a whopping 15 attacks at strength 7, -1 AP, 1 damage, again with lethal hits, so it's not as amazing into things like marines, but if he gets bogged down by guardsmen or gaunts or orc boys, he will just cut through them like butter. He can easily kill over 10 orc boys with this profile, so he will very quickly get through even the biggest squads of chaff in just 1 or 2 rounds of combat. Of course, on top of all that, he has a few exceptionally good abilities to go alongside his profile. Host of Plagues is his pick one of 3 abilities that most Primarchs and big heroes have. His choices are Miasma of Pestilence, which grants friendly Death Guard units within 6 inches cover against enemy ranged attacks, which is really useful. Diseased Influence allows reroll wound rolls of 1 for friendly units within 6 inches, which is again really useful, especially on ranged units like your bloat drones and your plague burst crawlers. And then Toxic Presence is an incredibly strong army buff. You get 3 inches of extra range on your contagion rule when you are within 12 inches of Mortarion. So not only can he get himself to a 12-inch contagion range from battle round 3, but also if you have another unit within 12 inches of him, you can potentially cover 36 inches of the board by your debuff, which is just mind-blowingly strong. It means that come the mid-game, almost no enemy unit, certainly no one in the midfield, will be safe from having not only their toughness reduced, but also their saves, their OC, or their weapon and ballistic skill. So it's a really, really strong buff, this one, and it means you can pretty much put on an army-wide debuff onto your opponent in some really strong and spectacular ways. His final rule that he has is a Lord of the Death Guard, and this got a huge buff as well in the Balance Dataslate. It lets units within 6 inches of Mortarion ignore all modifiers to characteristics. Now, there was a big question previously about what this affected before, but in the latest Dataslate, GW have confirmed it does include things like damage and AP, and what this means is that when you have units within 6 inches of Mortarion, all of that 2 or 3 or 4 damage weaponry won't be impacted by things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts with their -1 damage, or the Avatar of Cain with its half damage. All of those units that reduce damage are now so much more vulnerable to you. In some cases, they are 100% more vulnerable to your damage output, and equally, Marines with Armor of Contempt, that will no longer give them that extra level of protection in their saves. It is such a big change, and it really does affect, I think one of the big things it affects that people were talking about is Trajan for the Custodes, but Mortarion gets some huge benefit from it too, and being able to spread it out in a 6-inch aura, in my opinion, it just boosts him way back to the top of a competitive list. It is just such a powerful force multiplier, and for 325 points, him surrounded by some Plague Burst crawlers, or when he gets into melee and is able to put solid 4 damage into things like the Avatar instead of it being half down to 2, just makes him pretty much an auto-include in a Death Guard army now, I think. Finally, in the 5th spot, I did have a tough time with this one because there were actually 2 units I wanted to include. The first was the Plague Burst Crawler, which despite getting a points hike for the Sins of Indirect Fire, is still very, very good, I think, especially next to Mortarion. It is a solid toughness 10, 12 wound profile with that potent Plague Burst Mortar giving you a load of indirect strength 8, 2 damage shots, so it can do a lot of work in Death Guard armies. But instead I went for another unit, and this one actually got a fairly hefty points drop, and that is Typhus. Typhus dropped down to a very pleasant 80 points from 100, and he brings a few really key abilities to your army that I think are well worth adding in, especially if you are bringing Terminators or Poxwalkers, both of which he can join. His own stat line is toughness 6 with 6 wounds, a 2-up save and a 4-up inrun, so again, he is fairly damn tanky just by himself, but he also grants a -1 to be hit debuff against melee attacks when he's with a unit, so those Poxwalkers or Terminators that he joins will be even harder to shift if an enemy tries to charge them, and then combined with potentially the -1 weapon skill sickness if you took that, that can make most things hit him and his unit on 5s or 6s, which is really strong and will make them incredibly difficult to shift. He also hits back fairly hard himself. He's got 5 strength 9, -2 AP, 3 damage swings, or he can sweep with his Man Reaper for 10 strength 6, -1 damage swings. But I think where Typhus gets most of his value, and why I think he is probably worth bringing at 80 points, is in his brilliant Eater Plague ability. This little psychic power has an 18-inch range, and you roll a d6 in the shooting phase, and on a 2 to 5, an enemy unit that you pick takes d6 mortal wounds, and on a 6, they take d3 plus 3, so you can put out a whopping amount of damage into enemies with this, easily taking out a couple of Marines or a few Guardsmen, or even potentially killing off a lone character or an injured vehicle with almost no way to protect against it. It really is just such a brilliant power to have for 80 points. You don't have to worry about hitting or wounding or saves unless they have Feel No Pain. You can just easily dump d6 mortal wounds onto a key enemy unit, and he can easily make a solid 40 or 50 points back in a single shooting phase if you're lucky, so it is incredibly easy to trade up with Typhus at his 80 point cost. All you need to do really is kill 4 or 5 Marines over the course of the game, and he has paid for himself, which it is really easy to do with this power. He is just a fantastic buff piece for the unit he's with, and he is decent in terms of melee combat, and the Eater Plague is just a fantastic power for killing off basically anything that gets within 18 inches of him. So I think bringing him along with some Terminators or with some Poxwalkers, I've even seen people kind of run him solo just for that power, but I think joining a unit of Poxwalkers, if nothing else, will just make them another really difficult objective holding unit for the enemy to shift and deal with. And I just think he is a very, very worthwhile addition just to make his points back, if nothing else, by throwing off a few mortar wounds into certain enemy units. So that is the Death Guard. They have some very strong units that got a lot of benefit from the latest data slate. Mortarion is now amazing, I think, and even things that got nerfed like the Plague Marines and the Biologus are still very, very good with how the Death Guard can interact with the game and the debuffs and abilities that they can take advantage of. But as always, I'd love to know what you think of this list. Is there anything you would have included that I missed? And what do you make of the Death Guard in general in 10th edition? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.